Hello and welcome to episode 7 of the Alone podcast. Before we get started with our guest today, I've got one quick piece of business to tend to again. So I've got another review from Apple Podcasts to read off, and this one comes from LimaGirl11, and the review says, "I love this podcast. I'm finding myself anxiously awaiting each new episode. All are very unique as Sam introduces us to the show contestants. I highly recommend this podcast series." So thank you, LimaGirl11. And I guess I have to admit, also thank you to the Alone Podcast mom for leaving that. So that review comes from my mom, but it still counts. I'm sure that even though she's my mom, she means every word that she says. So thank you, Mom, for that review. All right, well, we'll move into the show. And tonight's guest is from season 3 of Alone. And we have Megan Hanacek on the line. So Megan, thank you so much for taking time out of your day away from your family to sit down and talk and share some of yourself with us.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here.
Great. Well, again, thank you for coming on. And, I guess we'll just jump right in. So you live in a place that probably not many people that are listening to this show know of, called Vancouver Island. That's right?
That's correct. Yeah. And they may know a little bit more about it now because it was season 1, 2, and 4 of the Alone show.
There you go. Not your season of Alone. You were in Patagonia.
That's correct. Yeah.
Did you know about the show before? It's like, did you get introduced to the show because it was on Vancouver Island, or how did that play out?
Yeah, and it's interesting because I actually worked for the government when the first season came through, and part of the production crew had to get permits from our government agency of the Ministry of Forests. So that's how I first about it. And it's funny how fast-tracked it happened. And then within 2 years, I ended up being on the show, but down in Patagonia. But I remember the first time we heard about it and we thought it was crazy. We thought it was crazy that people were going to go live out in the woods. And where we live in Vancouver Island, there's black bears and cougars and the occasional grizzly bear that comes across. So that's how I was introduced to the show Alone.
That's funny. And that's the last time you ever said something was crazy, right?
Yes, that's true.
Because then you end up right in the middle of it.
Yeah.
So Megan, so season 3 of Alone, Vancouver Island. So Megan, you are a forester, a biologist. I think mother is a title that probably should be probably higher on that list than I put it. What else are you, and who else are you?
I'm a small business owner in a field where it's predominantly men, and I'm a wife, and I'm an outdoors person, and I just really appreciate nature. And it's interesting that we get to talk about this today because the Alone show really was the culmination of a whole bunch of things in my life that came about in midlife. Just to be out in nature and to demonstrate my skills being an outdoors person. But the only thing that really conflicted with that was being a mom and a wife. That was the most trying thing for me.
Yeah, it's I can imagine. And obviously you're the first woman that's been on the show. That's not for lack of effort. I was starting to feel really self-conscious, like, oh man, like I have to get someone to say yes because this is going to start looking bad. But I guess if I've got 2 or 3 out of the first 10, then I'm kind of on par with what the percentages and averages are. So I think we'll be good. But I was actually just watching some of your footage from the show just to try and brush up, and I just saw one of those moments where you were reflecting on your children and being away, and I'm sure we'll talk about that in just a little bit, but it has to be a very interesting nuance on a show like this, or just really in the situation like that, being so far away, and probably the lack of communication. I can imagine it was probably the worst part of it.
Oh yeah, it was definitely something I had to really suppress. Like I didn't even bring a picture of my kids, and it's definitely not because I didn't want to bring a picture. I just knew that would tear me apart to look at my children. And luckily enough, I had enough confidence in my husband to walk away from my normal life. But it was a really heavy burden for him to carry too. He works full time as a professional, and some people may be surprised by this, but we didn't tell our children what was happening. My children at the time were 6 and 9. And we just didn't want to put them in that difficult position of number one, worrying what was happening to me. And, number two, just having to hold information that contractually we weren't allowed to share. And I think I was in a little bit of a more difficult situation because I was in the position where season 4 was being filmed up in my area. So when I returned back from season 3, season 4 was actually being filmed. And the week back after season 3, I actually ran into some of the production crew in my hometown. It was very bizarre going from South America and then running into season 4 production crew, grabbing a coffee in town. But yeah, very bizarre, very interesting. I'm glad I did it. It was a very, very unique experience to do, and I don't think anything else compares with it. Where you can look at the map of the Earth on Google Earth and sort of imagine going to a faraway place, but to just get dropped in there by other people and you don't really understand where you're getting dropped because you don't have a map with you, you don't have your cell phone or GPS, you're just dropped and you have to make the best of it.
That's man, I want to kind of go backwards in history before we get in here, but what you just said was kind of interesting to me. I think I've always worked on the assumption that you would have had the opportunity to like study a map and like some aerial footage, so you at least had like an orientation of this is where I'm at. Did that not happen for you?
No, so
Ooh.
the way it happened for me really quickly too with the show was I'd seen season 1 and I'd seen two of the first shows of season 2. And I had friends and colleagues say, you should apply for this. It's kind of up your alley. And I thought, oh, this is crazy. So I did put my name in and I got a call right away. And they said at production out of New York said, hey, we've already picked our potentials for season 3. So they're flying to New York next week. So it's already too late for that. But would you want to do season 4? And at that point, they did know it was going to be a couples. And I said, absolutely not. The only person I could think of that would go as a couple with me would be my husband. And there was no way both of us would leave our children. And my husband had no interest in doing this. So I told them that flat out. I said, no, I'm sorry. I can't. So I guess I'm kind of out. And they said, okay, just wait a minute. And they called me back that day and they said, we'll fit you in. So you're flying to New York next week. And it was bizarre. I had to phone my husband and say, okay, there's a bit of change of course. I'm flying to New York next
Remember
week.
Remember that thing we kind of talked about?
Yeah, totally. Right. And it happened so quickly because my husband knew I put a submission in, but we kind of thought nothing was going to happen right away. And then, within a day or two, it had changed to get ready, you're flying to New York and bring your knife that you usually use. And so I went to New York and I'm not sure if the other contestants have explained this, but it's a whole week of testing, even to get an ECG, psychological testing, field testing, where they want to see what you can do in the woods with very limited items. And I came back from that after that week and I said to my husband, I'm not getting picked. Like some of these people that are there out of the 20 were amazing. And Greg Evans was one of them. He blew me away. The things that he could make in the bush were like a domino, crazy trigger trap system that would go on forever. But really a genius bushcrafter. But then sure enough, by the end of that week, I think it was 5 days later, they called me and said, hey, do you want to go for season 3? Because you're one of the potentials. And if so, you're leaving in 3 weeks. And it just blew my mind because I was already of the mindset that, I'm not as good of a bushcrafter. And I always try to underestimate my skills. So, this is a huge learning experience personally on so many levels about, underestimating yourself and then actually being put in that position and just trying to make the best of what you can do. But, often people will say too, well, if I did that show, I would gain 100 pounds. But when you have 3 weeks to get ready and you're trying to get your 10 best gear items, I worked until the day before I left. And I had a family. I had to line up a nanny to help my husband out because it was the summertime up here. It was winter down in South America. So it was very stressful. And I managed to gain 7 or 8 pounds in 3 weeks, but it was hard for me. My body naturally wasn't used to that. So that was leading up to my season of season 3. And then just to walk away and leave your family behind and get on a helicopter and get dropped off in a spot that you haven't. So I knew about 3 weeks in advance that I'd be flying to Bariloche in South America, but I had no idea where. We landed in Bariloche, and someone picked us up and drove us, took our cell phones and drove us for hours. So you can kind of orientate yourself by the sun, but you have no idea where you're going and you don't have a map.
Like, man, I sure
And
hope
then,
that production company was legit, because this is getting scary.
right? Well, they spoke English when everyone else was speaking Spanish. So I kind of figured my odds were pretty good. It was the right production company. But yeah, so no, you don't really, and where you're stationed, leading up to getting launched for the 6 days in advance is substantially different. Like where we were stationed, there was rabbits and hares, and all of us were like, oh my gosh, this is going to be
all excited.
great. We're going to be eating hare every night. But we were actually flown up about 3,000 feet into the Alpine, and it was way different up there. I had one hare I had caught in my traps a couple of times and escaped, and that was the only hare I ever saw. And then there were some boars around in the middle of the night, and then they quickly left as soon as the snow fell. And then the fish started to really dwindle as the weather changed as well.
I can tell you're a biologist.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, because you're saying hare.
Oh, yeah. Not just rabbit.
Yeah, or like bunny. Or
yeah.
I can tell you're a biologist.
Yeah.
Well, that's fascinating. Yeah, I just, in my mind, I'd always envisioned that, because like for me, whenever I go somewhere, whenever we're going, out for any sort of adventure, I'm like spending hours looking at maps and satellite images, and just, I just want to know where I'm going, and I want to know where I'm at, and I want to understand more or less what the ground's going to look like before I get there. So I can imagine that being dropped off with that level of confusion about where I am, that would drive me insane. Just not knowing where I was and what was around me, and yeah, that would be very difficult.
Yeah, there's a lot of uncertainty around just putting yourself in the hands of people that are just dropping you into an area. And you really, it's like it's a bit of an explorer role. And when I was a kid, I loved, reading those books about people that would sail around the world and just go out to try to explore and make the best of their situation. And so that's, I think in today's modern world, we're really lacking a lot of that. And that's often being met by things like video games. And then that's creating a further divide with nature and, people, how we live our regular life. So I do appreciate that we had that experience. It was, and I often wonder, if I was in my mid-20s, how it would have been different, because I could have just walked away from my life a lot easier. But because I was in my early 40s, I had a whole established, like I had a company, I had another job, I had a family, a young family, a husband who was relying on me being a good wife. And it was a different situation.
Yeah, that's a lot. I want to take a second, and I want to back like way, way, way up, and just kind of start as well with you mentioned some stuff to me before we started recording, and so I kind of want to back up to, are you from Vancouver Island, or is that where you just ended up?
So I was actually born in Toronto, Ontario. Okay. And my family migrated to British Columbia when I was a child, like a baby. But stepping even further back from that, both my parents are immigrants. And my dad was actually an immigrant after the Second World War and spent time in a refugee camp for about a year and a half, and then immigrated as a preteen into Canada without speaking the language. And my mom was also an immigrant from Ireland, and she was an orphan. She was a family of 9, and her parents died when she was she was the youngest of 9, and her parents died when she was a young child. So I think in a way that kind of transferred to kind of my learnings as a child too, like just working through adversity and trying to make the best of situations. But anyways, long story short, yeah, I spent most of my time on Vancouver Island.
Gotcha. And so where did your dad immigrate to Canada from?
So they immigrated from Czechoslovakia into Southern Ontario, and lived on a farm and worked their way up as immigrants to learn the language and come in. They left all their culture behind, and from what I understand, it was kind of traumatic. Like they just left, they had holdings in Czechoslovakia and just kind of left in the middle of the night. And, like a lot of immigrants after that time, after the Second World War, were just looking for a better life, like a bit of stability for their family. And yeah, so that's where my dad immigrated to.
Did your grandparents ever go back to? I'm gonna have to be very careful. Czechoslovakia. I want to say Slovakia because that's what I'm used to.
Yeah.
But did your grandparents ever go back to Czechoslovakia, or did they not have anything left there for them to see once they had made their transition?
No, they never did go back. Which is interesting because my grandmother still had her sister over there. So I imagine for her that was a pretty hard thing. Like she was close to her sister too, and she never went back. And I think they did talk on the phone, but it was kind of like a totally different life for them after they moved to a different country. And probably, I'm sure, a little bit traumatic. In some ways, they just started a new life in a different country. So probably didn't want to look back too much.
Gotcha. And then your mom, so was she orphaned in Ireland, or did that happen after they had left?
Yeah, in Ireland, and she was the youngest. So it was like her elder siblings raised her, and she immigrated as a young adult.
Okay, that was my next question: is how did she end up in Canada? So it sounds like she had grown up a little bit and decided to move on her own.
Yeah. Yeah, Canada is definitely a place where a lot of people immigrated to. So we have a significant amount of First Nations still in Canada. And yeah, it's a really interesting time of evolution in Canada right now in terms of First Nation reconciliation in conjunction with people that have immigrated to the country.
Yeah, I guess that's kind of an interesting interplay, right? I mean, obviously the United States, we're a country of immigrants, but how does that look in Canada when you've got a lot of people that have immigrated and then you've got these First Nations peoples? How is that reconciliation, like what is that looking like right now?
Yeah, it's evolving quickly. And, I think there's a lot of, it's definitely in a transition right now. There are some treaties with First Nations, but there's a lot of evolution in terms of how to do that reconciliation on the land, especially around the land base, because First Nations have their territories and a lot of it is intertwined with nature. And as we know that there's been impacts through developments and just how we've managed resources that interplay with those values, whether it's salmon or wild game meats, just even forest cover. So it's definitely evolving quickly. And I'm in British Columbia, where a large majority of British Columbia is unsettled treaty. Like there's very few treaties compared to the rest of Canada. So it's a really interesting time to be a biologist and a forester in British Columbia.
Yeah, and maybe you just said it, and I'm not smart enough to understand what you just said. But so for a loan, for example, on Vancouver Island, was that on provincial land? Was it on First Nations land? Or since there were no treaties, is there not like First Nations land?
Well, there are some treaties, but not in the very specific place where Alone Season 1, 2, and 4 are located. So it was on Crown land, which is considered public land, and unceded territory were those. But from what I understand, production by the time Season 4 came around, they had engaged with the local First Nations to talk about how it would work by having a production company in that territory.
Gotcha. So there was involvement.
Yeah. And I wasn't involved in those discussions, but from what I understand, yeah. And I think that even on Season 4, I think they showed a little bit of it at the start of the show. They talked about the local First Nations. I don't think they did that in Season 1 or 2 from what I remember, but I think by Season 4, they had done that.
Yeah, I think on one of them, I remember there was a discussion of like the middens that are in the area that they had to like avoid, and I do remember there was some level of conversation for those. I mean, and correct me where I'm wrong, Megan, but since I used the term midden, I believe that's basically like a trash dump, right? Where refuse and other things would be.
Well, it's like a shell site. So often what'll distinguish a midden it's usually located near a beach. So it's like a gathering place, and where they would, a lot of the shells would end up accumulating. That's what a midden is usually distinguished as. The thing about our area and the thing about Season 1, 2, and 4 that's interesting too is The First Nation, so we were glaciated in British Columbia, except for a little chunk of Vancouver Island. And 14,000 years ago, those glaciers started to retreat. And First Nations have been, they've had establishment in British Columbia for 14,000 years, which is one of the longest standing known establishment sites in North America. So it's a really interesting area that we live in. And where I live, it's just got such diversity and a lot of large predators still, which you don't get in North America. So we have black bears and cougars and wolves, and grizzlies will swim over from mainland British Columbia sometimes. So it's just a very wild part of North America.
Is there a resident population of grizzlies that have stayed, or is it all just transient? They come and then go, and then, or is there?
Well, it's a bit of a swim, like some of the closer crossings. So between mainland British Columbia, which is about 97% of the land base in BC, Vancouver Island's about 3% of the land base. And between mainland BC and Vancouver Island, you'll have a scattering of hundreds of islands. So the grizzlies will jump from island to island, but then they have to do a big swim, and the closest spot is probably about 4 to 5 kilometers across. And it's usually the males that do those big swims. They'll get pushed out of the valleys by the other males, or they'll be in search of a female.
Yep.
So we do have grizzlies over here right now. It's just a matter of if they're breeding. So that'll totally change everything if they start breeding and having offspring.
If they find, like, if when they see or when someone has a sighting of a grizzly, do they try and find it and collar it so they can capture data on what the heck that thing's doing?
No, because there's so many. Yeah, it's such a, in British Columbia, we have about 96 million hectares. It's a very big land base with a lot of different dynamics with wild animals. So you could be studying and inventorying a whole bunch of different dynamics. But unless they start to, get really close to urban areas, and that happened a couple of years ago, 2 grizzlies, I think they were siblings, a female and a male, kind of unusual for the female to do a big swim, but they ended up on a small First Nations island where there's residents living over there, and it was a safety concern. So the male and the female were over there together, and they actually did tranquilize them, radio collared them, and then they helicoptered them over back to the mainland. But those are huge costs to do that, and and then to start tracking them. So unless it's a real concern safety wise for humans, it often doesn't happen. Or if it's a really concerted effort to get scientific information on a population,
so I guess that might be the difference between North America and Canada, right? I think we'd probably like, oh man, these grizzlies are doing a thing. Let's go collar them and figure out what they're doing. But up there, you're like, they're just grizzly bears. What's the big deal?
Yeah, there's different dynamics. I've seen the amount of money that gets spent on wildlife too, and also you got to remember that your population is almost tenfold of Canada's, right? So, and we have a lot of public land in British Columbia. The majority of 95% of our land is public with quotes, and only 5% private. Whereas in the States, it's there's more land that's private. So there's different dynamics at play too.
Gotcha. And that makes sense. So I mean, since we're here, let's talk about you. You've got kind of an interesting bio. So biologist, you're a forester. So can you kind of go through what both of those mean to you?
Sure.
And how you got to where you are?
Yeah, sure. So growing up, my dad was a biologist, and we grew in a very heavily dependent forestry town. Probably very much like when I grew up in the 70s and 80s, very much like the Pacific Northwest with a whole bunch of forestry towns. So I kind of got, I was influenced by both those dynamics growing up, and I spent a lot of time outside. My dad was a photographer. He had a photography business, and I did scuba diving and tons of camping and all that stuff. So I actually became a professional biologist first. And there's about 2,500 professional biologists in British Columbia. It's a really dynamic, biodiverse area of North America. So there's a lot of different values being managed. And then I actually did a lot of work in the States when I first started for the EPA and looking at environmental pollution. That's where I started. And then I ended up deciding that I was working with databases and GIS. And I thought, oh man, I want to spend more time outside. So I became a professional forester. And there's about 5,500 professional foresters in British Columbia. I think it's the largest concentration in North America. There's a lot of forest professionals in BC. And those are both regulated professions and very much like doctors and lawyers. We have a code of ethics, education, discipline process, and a whole diversity of what that means in terms of working for environmental groups, working for the government, working for industry. Yeah, so it's really interesting. It's a really interesting place to work in the world.
So as biologists, like for me, when I think of biologist, right, I'm think of wildlife biology and someone who is studying some, basically a life's career on a certain species or maybe on a certain type of biome or something. Did you have a
Yeah.
specialty, or do you have a specialty as a biologist that you focus on, or?
Well, I've kind of worked all over the place. I feel that like I'll work at places for about 5 years and then I feel like I've contributed as much as I can do. And I've also had my own company for 20 years, a consulting company. And the beauty of having a consulting company is you can often take on a whole bunch of different contracts. So things are always interesting to you. So my specialty, when people think of biology, they often think marine biology, but my specialty is not marine biology. My specialty is more terrestrial forest biology and mostly centric around British Columbia. We have a lot of different, they call them biogeoclimatic zones. And within all those different zones, so we have everything from a desert to alpine in British Columbia. There's different species usually associated or transcend different biomes. And since I've done over 20 years in British Columbia, I have different familiarity with different species and species at risk and different strategies for managing around wildlife, whether it's coarse filter, you set aside big tracts of forest and you hope you encompass all the habitat and functionality, or all the way down to how do you manage around a nest site or a bat colony. So yeah, and I work sort of in the regulatory world now and the policy world. So how are laws meant to evolve with new incorporation of science? And yeah, that's basically, it's a really dynamic, interesting field, always changing, always, different stakeholders involved. And in British Columbia, we have some really big policy changes happening this year. So it'll always continue to evolve. And you overlay that with climate change, and it just even makes it more interesting in terms of where projections are showing forests are going to change in the next decade or two.
Yeah. So then, so it sounds like your work as a biologist and a forester are pretty intertwined. So what's the difference then when you put your forester cap on? I mean, again, for me, I imagine Megan with a chainsaw when we say forester.
That's
So
definitely not the
yeah,
case.
so tell me what that means.
Well, they're both regulated professions, and within so biologists actually, just interesting enough, just about a month ago, just were granted right to practice, which means that they actually have a reserve right to practice in British Columbia, which is the first time in anywhere in the world that's been given to biologists. So it means that if someone comes in and is doing the work in a certain area around conservation or preservation, and they're not under that regulatory body, that they can't do that work. You have to have the certain education. You have to sign up for that code of ethics, standards of practice, have continuing education to maintain your knowledge. So it's defined what it means to be a forester and what it means to be a biologist. And my goal, like what I really do now, is work with stakeholders and figure out how we are identifying values that need to be managed and to try to maintain healthy populations. And sometimes that's involving having human influence. So doing some harvesting, and some of that harvesting may be for human uses, or it may be because of climate change or wildfire. How do you go into an area after a wildfire and reclaim that site to get it back to a healthy ecosystem?
Yeah, I'm glad you said wildfire, because I I'm kind of a nerd. I'm fascinated by all sorts of things, and wildfire is one of those that I'm very fascinated by.
Yeah.
I think it's such an interesting dynamic that we get to live with. And I've got my opinions on fire ant. I think, if people pay attention to wildfire and wildfire theory, something that kind of rings true to me, I guess, or something that is very interesting to me is the concept that as we do more fire suppression and more suppressing of fires, and then we can't keep up with the fuel work and everything else that needs to happen, ahead of that we're kind of making fires worse by not allowing the landscape to burn as it would without suppression.
Yeah.
It's how do you solve the wildfire problem?
And I'm not a wildfire expert. There are definitely people that dedicate their whole career to this in different segments, whether it's fire ecology or how to manage for wildfire. So I will give that disclaimer at the start. But I will say in British Columbia, one thing that's happened over the last 25 years is we are seeing a changing climate. So one thing that happened starting in the 90s, and I was involved in this, is we started to see our mountain pine beetle population exploding. And usually we would have very cold winters in the interior of British Columbia, and we start to see that we were just having milder winters. We wouldn't have 4 weeks of a cold snap under -10 to -20 to 30. It would just sort of hover cold negative temperatures for a week, and then it would warm up. And it was a native beetle, but it exploded around the province from the mid 90s for about the next 15 years. And it impacted more than 35% of the forested land base, so significantly impacted. And then when it ran out of lodgepole pine, it started going to other species as secondary host species. And so it killed a lot of the timber. And there was a lot of salvage and harvesting associated with trying to get the economic value off that timber, to try to reclaim ecosystem function, to reduce wildfire risk. And, there's some debate about, was that the appropriate level of harvest? Should maybe not all of that being harvested? Should more have been harvested? But we do have a lot of clear cuts throughout the interior of British Columbia after that. And we had a lot of dead trees and buildup of fuel. And then now we're still getting a changing climate. We're getting very weird weather events, including the heat dome that sat off Vancouver Island this year and then traveled throughout British Columbia. But we've had very big wildfire events in 2008, 2009, 2017, 2018, and 2021 in British Columbia. We have about 55 million hectares of forest land, naturally forested land. And just in the last 4 summers, we've burnt about 1 million hectares. And when
can you translate hectares to acres?
Do you
know what that means?
2 acres in a hectare.
How many?
Yeah. So it's significant. So just over 2 acres in a hectare.
Wow.
And I forgot you guys deal with acres. We deal with
hectares. 90% of the listeners are from the United States. And then Australia, I see you. You're awesome. So Australia is coming in tight for a second there. But yeah, most of us speak acres.
Acres, yeah. You'll have to excuse me on that one. So we've had really big events, like millions of acres in these last couple of summers. And the frequency is just abnormal. So it's a whole accumulation of like a whole bunch of different compounding effects at once. Changing climate, higher drought in the summer, and these heat events. And we had one of those events produced, I think it was like 70,000 unique lightning events, but they didn't all hit the ground. But when you get up to those big wildfire events, 70% of them are caused by lightning strikes. So you can imagine if you're not really letting these natural disturbance types, we call them, and the interior of British Columbia had very frequent fires, then if you're kind of suppressing them from happening for decades, they're gonna eventually take over because that's part of the natural ecosystem. So we're seeing a whole bunch of different effects happening at once, including the changing climate with these really abnormal events that are coming through and creating more lightning.
Yeah, it's so first of all, thank you for saying that, because I've always really it's resonated with me that if you don't let fire burn, like something at some point has to consume what is on the landscape. And if you can't get all the fuels out, I mean, it's, you're asking, to me, it seems like you're asking for disaster, but You talked about kind of the weather events and the things that you're seeing up there. I've noticed on your Facebook page. So again, at this point, I'm just going to own it. Doing what I'm doing, I kind of have to be a Facebook stalker, and I have to be very open and honest about the fact that I'm a Facebook stalker.
That's all good.
So I've seen a few different posts on your page. By the way, your Facebook is the most interesting I think I've ever seen, and I think a lot of it is due to where you live. But you talk about the weather and the kind of the changing patterns. And I think I've seen 2 or 3 things where you've posted about what you call an incoming storm. I'm pretty sure that the rest of the world calls those hurricanes. At least that's what your storms look like when you'll post, hey, there's a storm coming on, and it sure looks a heck of a lot like a hurricane. When you look at the image of it. What is it? I mean, what is it like living up there, and what is the weather like? And those storms, I'm sure they're amazing when they finally hit.
Oh yeah. So we see this in forestry. There was, I may get the year wrong, but I think it was around 1908. We had massive wind events off of northern Vancouver Island, and they blew down tens of thousands of acres of land. The forest trees just snapped off because we do get, these wind events, like our forest on the coast. That's sort of the disturbance type we get, is more wind related events when, abnormal winds come from a different direction and hit the trees. And they're maybe used to a westerly and they get an easterly storm that comes through. The interior of BC is more prone to like fire. That's sort of their ecosystem and their tree species type. But we don't. The kind of hurricane stuff that we're getting is not usual for us. So we're not used to the hurricanes, sort of like those low pressure. That was a record low pressure system that just hit, and apparently we're supposed to get another one this week. And I don't live right at the very tip of Vancouver Island. I was actually out there last weekend, but there's some wicked storms, and there's a lot of boats that have sunk off of the northern tip of Vancouver Island, because it's just right open ocean right there. That's the Pacific. And, so the next stop is Japan. So, we do get some wicked events, but what we're seeing now is abnormally unusual summer droughts, and we're in a rainforest. So it's very unusual, and a lot of precipitation in the fall. So you get very dry soils, and then you get these very heavy rains. We're notorious for rain, but not like record rainfall events in 24 or 48 hours. And then we're getting landslides because the ground it doesn't have time to it gets saturated and it just slides right off the bedrock, is what we're seeing. And they're called follicle soils. So there's a lot of different cool dynamics that you learn about when you work in forestry and biology up here.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I was like, this is a conversation that for me, just like personally, I could go on with dirt forever, right? Like, it's just fascinating. Hopefully someone out there is excited as I am about talking about dirt and fire and weather.
Well, I think that's part of what drew me to the Alone Show, is that, I'm not a bushcrafter. Grego Evans is a really close friend of mine, but he's a bushcrafter. But I am someone who's comfortable being in the outdoors, and I love just learning about nature. And there's always something to learn in nature, whether it's about insects or a different climate or soils, or how to use like the cambium of a tree bark, or what can you do with wood, or there's wildlife in this area. What do you learn about when fish feed, like what time of the day, or even the season? What are they feeding on at different times of the season? So there's always something really cool about nature. You'll always learn something, and in conjunction with that, you always learn something about yourself as well. And I think that's really how I think it's one of the tools to really build self-confidence in humans, and even my children. I think that's one of the ways, putting people in nature to really challenge themselves is one of the ways to do that.
Cool. I was going to make a joke about your Facebook page, because you said you're not a bushcrafter. And so I wanted to mention that, your Facebook is definitely lacking in friction fires. So you should probably, I think you're an Alone participant. You have obligatory things and put in friction fires on Facebook. I will tell you, during my
interview in New York, my final interview, I was in a room with 4 executive producers, and they said, well, like, do you know how to do a friction fire? And I know how to do it. I've done it before. I have a bow drill here. But I basically said to them, like, okay, I know how to do it, but like, why the heck would I spend time in a rainforest learning how to do a friction fire? Like, honestly, it's not going to work. It's almost impossible to do it. So just based on the wood density and the amount of, how like 10 months of the year, it's going to be wet wood.
All right.
So
Well,
anyway, they kind of laughed at that. They also laughed. They said to me, do you kind of wish that, because I'd opened the contract and I was like, what the heck, Patagonia? I thought it would be on Vancouver Island. And they asked me that. They said, oh, I bet you wish this, season 3 is on Vancouver Island. And I said, actually, I don't, because if I don't win it, I would never live that down. So it kind of gave me an out for not winning.
well, plus I'm sure to me, it'd be a lot harder to be, 50 miles or whatever from home than it would be to be 5,000 miles. Exactly. Because then you start to math, you're like, shoot, man, I could be home in 2 days if I really went for it.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's true.
So you before I sidetracked and went backwards to make fun of friction fires, you were talking about how you always learn something from nature and how, with your children that's something you're trying to do with them. Can you talk about that a little bit? Like what you've learned from nature, what it's taught, and maybe if you have a philosophy surrounding your children and how you're exposing them and teaching them about the world we live in and how healthy it is for us.
Sure. Yeah. So I will say that as a parent, I have the struggles too with kids that are being sucked into electronics. It's a constant struggle for us too. And what I find that I just have to make that extra effort to get my kids to go somewhere with me. And then once they kind of get over that hurdle of like, well, I don't feel like it, it's just easier to be home and be on my phone or iPad. They quickly redirect, and my husband and I try to get them consumed with nature and some of the events we do. So and we are lucky. I will say one thing. We are lucky that we live in an area where we can drive 15 minutes and be out of cell service and be out of internet service. So that's kind of one of our saving graces is we kind of have a default that, oh, sorry, there's no cell service here. So it kind of helps us out.
And turn the car around. It's right
Totally.
there. Cell service is at that tree.
Yeah. But, I think it's just, I think as soon as the kids realize that we're having a good time, and whether we're out fishing or like we'll fish from shore, go to the beach and explore, go camping, they quickly adapt to that. And then I think I want those to be their memories as a child. I want it to be just consumed with electronics, which I think we're all struggling with this as parents. It's a really difficult thing. And it does take some strategy to try to make these events happen to get our kids away from, these really addictive video games. And it's, I always, before my husband and I had children, I remember seeing kids on, little screens, and we're like, we're the idealistic parents. We'll never do that.
We're never doing that. And then the kid freaks out at the restaurant. Hey, here's the phone.
You got 2 kids, like, yeah. So, anyways, we really try to integrate, especially on the weekends or at night. Like, we're lucky enough we have a forest patch by our house, so we'll walk the dogs through that, and I'll pick mushrooms with the kids, and they love doing that too. Or we had a raven's nest in that same wood patch recently, so we go check that out. And I just think it's really important for my children to have that connection to Earth, wherever they end up living in the world, that they have an appreciation for the natural world. Even if they end up living in a city, that they can, make that connection through parks or the outskirts of that city area.
Yeah, see, it's interesting. So I live like smack dab in the middle of a city. The full metro area is over 1 million people. So I'm sure that your little spot on Vancouver is a little bit smaller than where I'm at. And yesterday we were in the backyard. I took my bow out and I was shooting my longbow in the backyard, and my daughter, she was so excited that I was getting my bow out. So she ran and grabbed her bow, her little, suction cup bow and her little arrows, and came out with me and was super excited to shoot. And so we shot a couple rounds, and I was trying to teach her a little bit, and I went to pick up my arrows and go back to where we could start shooting again. And I turned around and she was already over somewhere else she had commandeered someone's cell phone, you know? So we'd been out shooting and like instantly we went from shooting and she was so excited to go shooting to then just like instantly she's, you know, on a phone and doing that. I'm like, man, that changed quickly. But we do the same thing. We've got a garden in our backyard and all sorts of stuff, you know, so our girls are always pulling worms out and we're trying to find ways to keep them connected and to keep them, you know, like for example, this last summer, my daughter found some snail shells, right? And she was so excited wanting to learn about them. And so we downloaded an app and tried to figure out which snails they were, and that didn't work. So we reached out to, you know, the local university that has a great biology department and, you know, built a friendship there. And so we try and do things, but it definitely takes effort and it definitely takes work to teach your children, especially if you live not, you know, if it's hard for you where you're at. I mean, it's much more challenging when, you know, we can drive 15 minutes and be in the mountains, but you're not away from people. You're not away from service. I mean, you're still basically in the city. You're just on a trail.
Yeah. No, you know, but there are ways to use electronics and apps and things on those electronics too. Like, you know, even like apps that identify plants. And so there's, you know, it's one of those things I think you can't be binary. It can't be, you know, none of that in your world because our kids are going to have to learn how to deal with it. But it's a challenge. It's a struggle. And it's something like, you know, our generation never really had to contend with. Like, I think the first time I got a cell phone was in my 20s and it was a big clunking, you know, it would get hot when you were on it for 5 minutes sort of thing.
The pager in school, right? The cool kids.
The pager. Yeah. I wasn't lucky enough to have a pager. But that was for the cool kids, like the doctor kids.
Got their pager so mom can tell them that she's on her way type of a thing. That's funny. Well, so let's kind of move forward a little bit. So we've already we'll go back to where we were. So you had talked about your time on alone and you were talking about your husband and your children. You know, one of the things that I'm most interested in when it comes to talking to people is hearing those experiences of the family or whoever else that was left, right? And so what was that like for your husband with 2 young children? I mean, I'm thinking of myself, I'm like, man, that's a heck of a lot of work. It's a lot of work with 2 people, let alone with one.
I know. And there wasn't really a lot of communication with production in those early seasons with families. So they've since improved that because it was as
far as like checking in and saying, hey, Megan's still alive.
Like my husband would maybe send an email. Yeah, exactly. It'd send an email. And he's really independent, but you know, every 3 weeks he would just send an email and there'd be no response. So, you know, and then, so they've improved. I think they do check-ins with families once a week now and sort of kind of like no news is good news. But like it was really like I said, we'd only seen the first season of Alone. We hadn't seen all of season 2. I think when I was out there, my husband saw the rest of season 2, but you know, you kind of don't know what you're getting into in a lot of ways. Like you're like, okay, season 1 only went 50 days. I can do 50 something days. I can do it. But our season went so long. Like we went, you know, another 50% longer than the season I'd seen. Like we went.
Fowler was what, like 76, I think.
I went 78 days and Fowler went 87 days. So, it's a long time, like 3 months. And then plus you're there before the production for about a week. And then they hold you for about 5 days after. I was like, by the time I flew back through Brazil, my visa was expiring in the air. I almost didn't get on my flight back to the States because I was at day 89. And they pulled me aside and actually held me for a couple hours because they said, we don't know if you can fly because your visa actually expires at day 90 and you'll be in the air to Atlanta. So I had to call production and get that sorted, but I almost didn't make that flight too. Like, so there's all these behind the scenes things that happen. And I would say we've kind of somewhat joked, but if they were to do like a split screen of what I was doing, and then my husband's at home trying to manage the household. And I'm a pretty low key person. So I wasn't the most dramatic person on TV. But I would almost say like what was happening for him was probably a lot more interesting than it was for me. People would stop him because we live in a small town, and for me to be gone for months is kind of unusual. And we haven't told anyone, and then he doesn't
Oh
want him back.
yeah.
He's worried about me, and people are
Hey, are
stopping
you and Megan
him in the
okay?
grocery store.
Like,
I'm pretty sure they didn't mention. Yeah, like I actually had a couple coworkers show up at my house. I found this out later, and they said, "Where is she?" Like one of my close friends,
call
and
the
I hadn't told
cops?
her.
Ah.
Well, they had a meeting. Like I guess they had a meeting at the workplace and said, like, "Do you know where she is? Like, how well do you know Megan's husband? Like Tyson,
Oh
how well
my
do you know him?"
gosh.
One of them showed up at the house, and he kind of made light of it, like, "She's fine. Like, just don't go check the backyard."
No.
But they're like, "No, seriously, where is she?"
How long had I mean you have how long had you been married at that point in time?
We had been married 10, 9.5 years at that
Okay.
point.
And is he from the island or is he from somewhere else?
Yeah, he's from a small town. We didn't grow up together, but we're from the same area. We met in our 20s. So at least we kind of grew up in the same sort of lifestyle at the north
Okay.
end of Vancouver Island.
And that probably helps too. I'm just imagining, oh yeah, that in a small town, that's a really like. I'm surprised there wasn't some sort of official investigation into your husband. Like, where did
There was
she
a lot of
go?
rumors. You know how small towns are. Some of them quite bizarre, but
Can you share?
um,
Can you share the best
and
rumor of what happened to Megan?
oh, I think there was one that maybe well, there was a couple actually. There was one, maybe she is in the CIA was one of them. The other one was, I think she's working on because my husband and I had worked in the polar regions in Arctic and Antarctica before. So we've done some kind of neat things. We've been on all seven continents. But there was another rumor I was involved with. I think at some point they had discovered some explorer's boat in the Arctic, and someone seemed to think I was on some expedition. I don't even know how that one got started. I was on some expedition as a biologist involved in that one.
Well, I
I
will
think
say this: it says a lot about your character when the juiciest rumors that your town can come up with is that you are on an Arctic exploration looking for a shipwreck that was found. That's
gold bullion or something. Yeah.
yeah.
Um, I know, or that, and then of course people are like, well, does she just like, what else is she, did she just split? Like she just leaves her town, her hometown she's been for decades and she's just had enough. Like, but I think the one that, yeah, the most feasible ones was that I was doing some type of research somewhere. Yeah.
That's funny. So I mean, what was it like? I guess how did your husband handle it? Like when you came home, did he just like pass out and take a nap for a month or?
Um, No, my husband's great. He was really supportive. And it was such a big recovery process because we didn't have a refeeding process. Um, it's in some ways it's like I hate to, there's a lot of beneficial things, but in some ways you are doing quite a bit of trauma to your body, right? Whether it's suppressing these emotions that you miss your family and you can't tell anyone, to actually, the turmoil of like going through a lot of starvation and nutrient deficiencies and mineral deficiencies. So there is some recovery, and it's something they do have psychologists. They started bringing psychologists in after our season, actually, with one of the contestants that was starving quite a bit. And but like just even talking to other people, like the best bonding that happened was with the other contestants that went around the same time frame that you went. That was by far, many of us have really bonded over having gone through such a unique experience and then making a TV show about it, and then not actually seeing the footage until everyone else in the world is watching it at the same time as you. So our season, I think it was like at that point in time, every episode, it was about 2 million people were watching at a point in time. But by the time it was like spread throughout the world, it's tens of millions of people. And I think it was like during COVID when they declared the world emergency, the World Health Organization, that Friday. I got 800 friend requests that first night. And the second night, I had like another 700 friend requests on Facebook. It was like all of a sudden people were like reaching out to anyone who had gone through survival situations before. It was so bizarre. Like, it was like, what is
Like, have
happening?
you
Like,
seen my Facebook? I don't have a single friction fryer. Go to someone else.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I have gone through starvation though. So yeah, get high fat food. That's what I recommend. Stockpile, not toilet paper. Go after high fat food. Forget the toilet paper. Don't worry about that. That's way down the list.
Oh, that's funny. So I mean, your kids, how was it like? I mean, if you that it's personal, right? So if you want to skip,
That's
that's
okay.
fine.
Yeah,
But
we can talk about that.
when you came back and you saw your kids again, and when they saw you, and then all of a sudden they see mom on TV, and what was that like? What was that whole? I mean, there's just so
Um,
much there.
well, I think they're pretty young and they've done a couple of events with me too. And it's not like I'm just mom, right? I think maybe when they're later in life, they might look back at that and be like, holy, that was really, really a different thing that our mom did. But my son's a preteen now. My daughter's just coming into the teen years. So it's kind of like I think maybe later in life they might look at that and be like, oh yeah, that's really unusual. Like it's kind of neat too. Like a lot of moms don't do that. But we haven't like we have a really busy life. Like my husband's professional, I'm a professional. We have a whole bunch of other things going on in life. And I have been asked to be on the show again, but it just, for me, that was a huge chunk of my children's life. Like maybe when they're older, I might do something like that again. But for me, I just have a different priority set of what's going on in our life right now. So it comes up all the time. Like I think I mentioned to you before we started talking, it comes up a lot. Like I've been recognized before in pools down island, and I've had to get out of the pool and get my picture taken with someone in my bathing suit, which is super bizarre. And my kids are just kind of like, oh man. But to them, I'm just mom, right? So it's not really there are some inside jokes that we make fun of, like things sometimes. Like when I did make it to the final show on season 3. And there was polls, like, and because of the editing, they try to keep everyone guessing who's going to win. I think at one point I was in the lead because I caught quite a bit of fish in that last week I was there. I'd kept some roe and caught the male fish after that rainstorm. But after I tapped, I had a bit of a troll who called me a tapper outer. She's just a tapper outer. So in our family, that's a bit of a joke. Like, oh, you're just a tapper outer. So there's little things where it's intertwined in our life still. Yeah, it was a very unique experience. And they were even on TV when they showed the family before I left. So that's kind of neat too. People have mentioned it to them, oh, you're on TV, but yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. So we're talking over. We had. So for everyone else, we'll kind of reveal. We'll go past the fourth wall here. We went back and forth on how we were going to record this phone call and this conversation, and so we ended up being on Zoom, and so we can see each other. And I just want to comment that as you're talking about these experiences and you were reminiscing over that time, you, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you seem to have a look of fondness on your face as you're thinking back to the fish you caught and as you're thinking back to that experience.
Yeah.
Am I wrong, or
This experience is such a it's kind of a weird thing to call it, but like a complicated onion. There's so many layers to it. Like it's not only that it's a very unique experience. If you were to pay for an experience where someone says, I'm going to take you around the world, just show up at a place, you don't know exactly where you're going to go, and you're going to have a crazy experience where you have to demonstrate all your skills in an environment you've never been in, just based on your knowledge and your ability to adapt and self-soothe yourself through different events and leave your whole life behind. So there's that. But then there's also the experience of like, you're going to be starving. You're going to go further and further into decline. I don't know. Well, yeah, a couple of guys in the later seasons have done really well in terms of gaining big game. But most people have, like, you start depleting your body resources, and the weather always gets worse. That's how they time the seasons. But then you have to film everything, and you're by yourself, and you have to do multiple camera shots all the time in the daylight and even some at night. You have to record everything. So, and then you have to come home and you don't get to see how it's edited. And they were pretty truthful with the editing, but you're watching it when everyone else is watching. Like when they showed me shaving my legs, I was like, man, like they had 800 hours of footage of me and they showed me for an hour. And, you just forget about something. Like I had forgot, like that was like months, it was about 3 months after that they showed it. And
And they
you
spent a
know,
long time showing you shaving your legs with that knife you had there.
I know with that Bowie knife. Yeah.
Yeah, I
But
just
you're like, oh, I forgot I did that because I did like 200 other traps on land. But no one, and people always say we want to focus on the skills, but in all honesty, they want to see like the other parts too. Like no one wants to just see a strictly bushcraft show.
yeah.
Yeah. So it's a very complicated, something that is really deep within my psyche. Like, and I know it is for the other contestants that have gone a long time. It's just, and it is life changing. Like it did change parts of me when I came back to my regular life in terms of how, in the context of, me being a contestant with other contestants in a very similar situation around a lake, and you start to view yourself in the context of, oh, that's weird. I approached it that way. But Kelly, who was right beside me down the lake, approached it differently. So you start to even question how you approach things in life and if there's different angles of approaching things. And I think you start to question just your priorities in life and where you want to spend your time and what is important in your life. Like for me, it's about my relationships, my family, and just really spending my time on things that I want to spend my time on. And that I know deep down that no matter what happens, if I'm going to make a decision, we all are bound by monetary restraints and getting a shelter over us for our family and getting food and dealing with stresses of life. But I just know after going through something like that, like like nothing can be as hard as doing something like that, where you're dropped into a situation and you need to just come up with a plan and make it work. And I've gone through that. So I know that no matter what happens, I have a bit of that confidence that I can make things work. That, yeah, it might be hard and stressful, but I'll get through it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and obviously you would have had some physical ramifications, right, from the show that I'm sure have
Yeah.
lasted and persisted for a long time. Did you have any like emotional challenges, I guess, when you came back? Was it a struggle for you to kind of reintegrate back into society and family life? I mean, I can imagine, being out for that long and in such a primal state,
Yeah.
then coming home, and especially coming home to, the rat race that is young children and all of that. What was that like?
Yeah, it was because you actually do use different parts, the cortex, like when you're in a survival state, it's a different type of like how your brain operates, even. It's more of a primitive way of thinking. And then just trying to get back into the regular routine of, just that sort of structure that's outside of that primitive way. Yeah, it did take some time. And luckily, I do have support around me, like including my family and husband, and my kids were great. But it did take a while to integrate. And I know many of the other contestants from our season 3, it took like a good year, like even a couple of years to kind of wrap your head around going through such a big thing. Um, Such a really unique experience and being on TV, all of it. And none of us had preparation for like how people were going to troll us on social media. And the interesting thing about the alone contestants, just talking to the psychologist who was involved with our group after, is because she was involved at the front end too, is they do tests, and the majority of the people that had been on Alone up till that season, and I would say on the seasons after that, are introverts, like heavily introverted. I'd say I'm a sort of an ambivert, but kind of skew towards introverts. And then all of a sudden you're just filming everything about your life in this little world of your own, where you're out there in the middle of the woods, where it's like very introverted. And then it's blasted around the world for everyone to critique, and it's edited to just show a small portion of what you've done out there, or your fumbles or the drama or me crying. And so all of a sudden you're into that world of social media. So it was a really big learning experience about how to handle that too, because there was no guidelines. And there was a lot of troll. Like I had someone that thought I was getting my hair colored out there because I was 41 and I didn't have gray hair. I thought, man, if I like, that's the least of the things that I'd want brought to me. I'd want hamburgers brought to me, not some hair color. So just weird things, and it just makes you realize like in all honesty, what a bit of a mass social media is and how it's really influenced society. There's good things about social media, but it just really makes you realize like and I've been very cognizant with my teenagers just around social media use, because there's a lot of unfettered negative stuff happening on social media as well.
Yeah, I can't remember if I had shared this on one of the earlier episodes of the show, or if I don't remember if I talked about this or not, but for me, I hadn't used social media for like 5 years, right? And then I had this crazy idea to start, and I'm a pretty happy-go-lucky, like it's pretty hard to get me down type of an individual. And so I hadn't used social media in years, and then I have this crazy idea, I'm going to start a podcast, right? That's not what I do.
Yeah.
And if I want people to listen to the work that I'm producing and hear your stories, and social media kind of becomes a requirement there. And I'd been back on social media for like 2 days, just promoting the podcast and trying to get in touch with people from the show. And I started finding myself getting super depressed. And I was like, man, if it's doing this to me after 2 days, I can't imagine. Like it makes sense why there's so many struggles for a lot of people, is because it's just a cesspool of sadness and depression and anger and echo chamber, and and I can't imagine having that then pointed in your direction because of whatever, you walked past something on a show, or it took you 3 strikes to light a fire as opposed to 1, or whatever.
Yeah.
That would
and
be...
and I will say our season, like the 3 women did very well. We came in the top 5, and it's interesting. You start to, because I've been a male dominated profession for decades, and like, it's in terms of forest professionals, about 15% are female, but when you actually start looking at the whole industry, like the logging truck drivers, the fallers, the people in camp, it's about 95% male. So I kind of have always just like disregarded it, but you start to realize systemically too, just how constructs are made. And like, just even the females doing so well in season 3, all of a sudden people are disregarding that and saying, oh, they must have had help, or, they had the easier sites, or just anything to disregard how difficult it was for us too. And it was difficult. I lost, I was down to 101 pounds. And when I got out, because I was given just regular food, I went down to 94 pounds. My body went through a lot. And, and then all of a sudden you're up against that just because you're female. And I've proven myself for decades already in a male dominated field, but then you're thrown into the world of social media. And it's like, oh man, now I'm faced with this. Like all of a sudden I'm kind of thrown to the wolves and people. And then you start to be like, why do I even care? I don't even know this person. But it does start to, it starts to grind on you, because the men weren't getting that same type of critique. And, some of the other women would jump in from our season. We try to support each other and jump on posts. And then it just becomes this all consuming thing where you're just trying to fight something that shouldn't really exist. Like it just, yeah, that was a difference for us as females in doing so well in our season. And, I think all of us just wait for the day for a female to win. It'll happen too. And I think that day is coming very quickly. So I don't know if that'll make a difference, but I think, yeah. And just even the debates, like recent debates have been like, we'd like to see a season of Alone just with all females. And, and then the whole debate about that, the merits of having that, or like not having that. And I actually think it should be more about debates about having people of the same same body mass index, or not having same percentage of body fat. Cause I think that is the really big determinant. It was in the early seasons anyways. It was, when you look at actually what was caught in terms of game and who ended up placing very well that had extra body fat, it was a huge benefit to have that. Anyways, I digress. But
no, I was just thinking if Alone goes to a weight class system like professional fighting, we'll know that Megan gets the credit.
Well, I don't think I was the only one that ever said that.
There's a heavyweight champion every year. There's a lightweight champion every year. So I guess, does that kind of, I don't even know how to describe it. Does that disrespect, does that still get to you, or have you found a way and found a place where you're able to kind of look over it and see small-minded people for small-minded people and live
Yeah,
your life.
I think it doesn't bother me. And I think what it did make me realize though in mid-career is it made me realize some things about my profession that I had just sort of chosen to ignore, that I'll just tolerate that sort of thing. But it made me starting to realize that there are some systemic things that why should I have to tolerate this as a female? If I was male, I wouldn't have to tolerate what's happening in this situation. So it did make me reflect on that, that disregard for females in that type of situation and undermining of humans just because they're a certain sex. It made me reflect on my regular life and actually just have a low tolerance for that BS, and start to question things and actually call things out when they happen.
That's cool. So people online trying to tear you down have actually made you stronger. And
it just made me actually be like, you know what? No, this is not right. And I'm not going to get into it on social media because I think that's just a bit of a, you're just going to end up down a rabbit hole. But in my real life, I will address these things because they are really important. On social media, it's one thing. I don't care what that person thinks about me that lives down in, Tampa, Florida, that, is sitting in there.
That says they live in Tampa, Florida.
Or wherever it is. But but in my real life, it's like, you know what, and I think that comes with confidence, just having gone through something so hard and proven myself that you do have that foundation of like, no, just wait a minute. Like, I'm not going to tolerate that. And I'll question that and I'll challenge that because I agree in equality and fairness. And if people work hard, they should be compensated for that.
Yeah, that's great. No, that's great. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I'm glad that I don't even know how to describe it. I'm glad that was able to turn into something positive for you, and that you've been able to take that and not find your voice, because you seem like someone who's kind of always had that voice, but maybe realize that there were places that voice needed to be exerted, right? For yourself. But I think something I've seen you talk about, and I think that we talked about a little bit offline, is that now you're trying to use that voice to, for example, to bring more women into forestry and to kind of level that playing field. And so it's cool that that's working for good.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah.
So, well, Megan, thank you so much. This has been so fun. It was funny. I was talking to someone earlier and they were mentioning how excited they were for a conversation that I was having. And I was like, this, I told him, I was like, basically, I'm doing this selfishly, right? Like, for me, I love talking to people and I love getting to know people and hearing their stories and I guess fulfilling my nerdy thoughts on fires and all sorts of just weird stuff. So for me, this is just totally, it's just fun, right? This is just straight fun. So thank you so much for taking time. And before we wrap up, I just want to, first of all, do you want people to find you anywhere? And if you do want people to find you anywhere, where can they find you? Or if you prefer people don't find you, we can skip that too.
Yeah, maybe don't come to my hometown and try to find me. But on Facebook, and I'm on other social media. I've had a couple get it hacked, and I know a couple other alone contestants have had the same thing. So Facebook is where I'm most active in terms of posts and what I'm up to. And I have done courses in the past. I'm pretty busy with other professional work right now, but Carly and Greg and I did a course that I organized in my hometown, and we may do a few of those in the future coming up as well. So that's where I would advertise it.
Okay. So Facebook, Megan Hanacek.
Yeah, that's right. Okay.
Well, we'll link that. And is there anything else, I guess, before we wrap up that you want to share, or anything that you need to set me straight on, or just any parting thoughts before we close?
I listened to the first couple of podcasts from you, and I think it's great. I look forward to listening to all of them because it's also a learning experience for me too. And, in relationship to my own experience. So I think it's a great idea for a podcast. And I think, it'll be interesting to listen to. I hope you get all of the contestants one day, because that'll be very interesting.
Hey, if you guys are out there, especially those of you who are hard to find and who have gone back to nature, yeah, look me up.
Yeah. Sounds
But
good.
no, I appreciate you saying that, and I know we're trying to wrap up, but this for me, it kind of started on as just kind of a random thing. I shared this with one of their contestants. I think it was with Jose or someone, just, how I had watched the end of one of the seasons or the last season. I was like, you know what I should do? But it's really kind of turned into something much more than kind of a harebrained idea for me, because as I've spoken, hearing you say how much you appreciate it, realizing that there is something here, right? And to hear that it's meaningful to you who have experienced this is really meaningful to me. And it makes me realize that this is turning into more of something for me than I really thought it would. So thank you for your kind words. I really appreciate it. Thank you for coming on the show. I look forward to just seeing what you do in the future. For those of you that do track Megan down on Facebook, you can look forward to seeing such things as hurricanes that apparently aren't hurricanes, ships that are on fire, and
Yes.
like
Wild
fridges.
wild animals. I've had 13 run-ins with cougars, and yeah, there's lots of cool stuff in this part of where season 1, 2, and 4 were filmed. And
Yes.
I'm just lucky enough to be able to live it every day of my life up here.
Yeah, so if you're looking for something positive, and well, it's not all positive, but something interesting at least that isn't people fighting, Megan's a great place for that. So Megan, again, thank you so much for your time. I will let you get back to your family and look forward to seeing what happens in the future. So take care and have a good night.
Thanks, Sam.
Bye.
Bye.